All right, welcome everyone. I'm Mike Bergen. This is my co-host, colleague, and dear friend, Amy Seeley, and we're here to share with you today a game plan for the Enhanced ACT. As you know, or maybe you're just finding out, the ACT is changing, and we have a new test that is going national in September, and now is the time to figure out exactly how to approach it.
So I'll just introduce myself. I'm Amy Seeley. I'm the president owner of Seeley Test Pros in Cleveland and Leap in Cincinnati. I've been working with students for all kinds of tests since 1994. I'm also an ACT instructional mastery trainer. So what does that mean? It means that I work with educators across the country and helping them better understand how to deliver high quality instruction for the ACT to their students. I'm also the co-host of the Test and the Rest College Admissions Industry podcast. And then I'm also a founding board member of the National Test Prep Association. And of course, here is my co-host.
I'm Mike Bergen, president and owner of Chariot Learning, helping high schoolers with test, school, and life from Rochester, New York to the entire world. We specialize in SAT and ACT prep. I am the creator of the TestBright SAT and ACT curriculum, which is a full service, out-of-the-box SAT and ACT curriculum with teacher's material, licensed in 14 states and 2 countries. I'm the publisher of probably too many newsletters, all having to do with education, testing, and admissions. The College Eagle newsletter, which is a free weekly on everything that's happening in higher ed and that applicants should know. The Roots to Words, free word of the day, learning to unlock eloquence, mastering the roots of words, and Tutor the Newsletter, a newsletter for, you guessed it, tutors and educators. I, with Amy, am the co-host of the Test and the Rest College Admissions Industry podcast since 2019, podcasting about testing, admissions, education, and learning. With over 650 episodes, we definitely have a lot of content. We've spoken to a lot of experts over the years, and we release at least one episode a week. I am the founding president and president emeritus for the National Test Prep Association, which is the nonprofit organization that supports the test prep industry. Like Amy, I am an ACT instructional mastery trainer, working with teachers across the country on how to implement standards and strategies. Basically, if you take anything from my bio and Amy's bio, it's that we are heavily engaged with everything going on with testing and admissions. We have great contacts at ACT, and everything we're sharing today is basically, we think, everything that anybody knows about the ACT outside of Iowa City, where ACT Incorporated is based. So let's get into kind of where we are today and where we'll be tomorrow. Okay, where we are today is in a very stable ACT environment, in that the ACT has been the same since its inception. It's been, a test of English, reading, math, science, and those 4 sections on what is called the legacy ACT contribute to your 1 to 36 scale score. You get a 1 to 36 for each of these 4 sections. They are averaged, and rounding rules are applied to the English, to get a 1 to 36 composite. There is a writing test, and the writing test is optional. It was optional when it was released, and today it is, for admissions purposes at least, unnecessary. So we're not going to say anything else about writing. It's going to be on the Enhanced ACT, but no one's going to take it unless they're taking the writing as part of their state test. The ACT has to date tested new field items through a 5th section that has appeared at the end of the exam and is clearly a non-scored section. That's the legacy test. Students can still take the legacy ACT. It's a paper test in most locations. They can take this test in June, and they can take this test for the very last time in July of 2025. What you want to know about the ACT, and kind of the legacy test sets the standard of what everybody thinks about the test. And the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the ACT is that it is fast-paced. What they call in the industry a speeded test, it just means that the number of items and the amount of time per item and the amount of time it takes to answer these items feels constrained for many test takers, and it's quite common for students to fail to get to all the questions on one or more sections. That is part of the dimensions of difficulty of the exam. The legacy ACT is primarily available on paper. National administrations are almost always paper. Sometimes students can take a computer-based test as part of an in-school assessment or state testing. The other thing about the ACT that we have known up to now is that 3 times a year, students who take the ACT can request what was called the test information release. And that means that if you took the test, say last April, June, and December, you could pay an extra fee to get a copy of your answers and also a blank, or let's say a clean version of the test that you took so that you can fully review it. That's something that ACT is sticking with, and it's something that you can't get from any other college entrance exam.
So now let's talk about what everybody is here for. And that, of course, would be the enhanced ACT format. So know that ACT is using this language of enhanced to reflect the new ACT that will be, well, I shouldn't say will be released, was released on the April 2025 digital version. So what you can basically see here, based on what Mike's comments were about the legacy, is that we're noticing some of the changes have to do with the idea of reducing the number of question items per section in most sections, and therefore being able to reduce the amount of times that students are spending taking the test. What we'll notice is that this reduction very often, especially in English reading and science, will be basically the removal of questions or the removal of passages. But what we're going to notice is that, like, for example, in the English section, you're going to notice the reference to FT, which means field test. So we know that ACT used to have a designated 5th section where students could get a section of either English, math, reading, science, where those would be experimental. They would not have counted in students' scores. And as you can probably imagine, when you make experimental questions a designated section, that does mean that students will know it, and they might not take that section as seriously. So we're going to notice that in English, one of the English passages, 10 of them, 10 questions, will not count towards a student's score. In reading, one of the reading passages, 9 field test items, will not count towards a student's score. In math, it will only be 4 questions that will not count, and then in science, it will be 6. So essentially what we're seeing here is this idea of English, reading, and math, a reduction in the amount of time, a reduction in the amount of questions. We will notice, though, in the science section, they have increased the amount of time. So essentially what students are now getting is a test where if you're trying to factor in how many seconds per question, they're essentially getting more time per question, which is going to ultimately create kind of a revised test that hopefully students may be more successful on. Now you'll notice that if we do the sort of calculation, if students are taking just the English, reading, and math sections, they're going to get a test that's slightly over 2 hours. If they opt, and we'll talk more about the science later, if they opt to take the science section, then the test will be slightly shorter than the current version of the test. Now keep in mind, this new version is only available in digital format for the upcoming June and July 2025 tests, but it will be available in all formats as we move to the September 2025 test date. So if we take a look at what are some of these format changes overall, we're essentially saying that students are going to be getting an average of about 10 seconds more per question item, which will vary a little bit from section to section. The overall testing time is going to be reduced. So of course, we all know that if students don't have to take as much time to sit for a test, maybe they're going to be, do a better job because their attention and focus will not have to go for quite so long. Students will get fewer items per section. And like we said, essentially students are not going to have to do that 5th designated experimental section anymore. Now, the other important thing to understand is that the science section is now going to be considered optional. Now, what that means is students will choose in this enhanced ACT whether they want to take the science or not. We're going to talk about why we think they should take the science section, but essentially students are going to get scores in English, math, reading, and science between 1 and 36. Now, if a student does take the science section, they will be able to receive a STEM score, which is a score that reflects their performance in both the science and the math sections. So what we want to do now is we want to dive into what do these changes look like by section. So for example, if we're talking about the first section of the ACT, which is the English section, what we do know is that previously, not every English question had a question stem, which means did not have an actual question a student would read and respond to. What we do know now is that every single question will have a question stem or a question. So students can kind of pay attention to what the question's asking, and that's going to help assist them to determine what might be the best or correct answer. As far as time, we know that because the test is shorter, they did have to reduce the number of questions per passage in English. So we know previously there were 5 passages, there are still 5 passages. One of those passages will not count, but therefore we're going to find fewer questions per passage in the English section. Now we're also aware of those 5 English passages, one of them that will be added will be of an argumentative essay nature. So think more of like a persuasive type of essay, and there will be specific questions that will go along with that particular passage. Ultimately, because we're seeing a different distribution, different number of questions, a different distribution of topics, we are going to notice in the 3 key reporting categories of English that those are going to be rebalanced. So for example, in the past, conventions of standard English was the largest percentage of questions, and it will still remain the largest percentage, but what that percentage is going to be reduced. So students will notice sort of some shuffling in terms of those percentages by reporting category.
So the ACT math section is undergoing some notable enhancements as well, and all of them appear to make the test seem easier. And it's important to point out at this juncture that you don't make a test easier. If you remove one dimension of difficulty, you have to add another somewhere else. So for example, a very superficial change is reducing the number of answer choices per math question from 5 to 4. It was a weird kind of holdover remnant that there were 5 math choices, and students who guessed randomly would have a 1 in 5 chance of getting it right. Now they have a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right. Statistically better odds of guessing and getting the full point. And just a tweak like that should mean that the test is going to be easier unless you change something else. Also, ACT is reducing the number of questions in what is called the Integrating Essential Skills reporting category. That is the reporting category, right? On the legacy test, roughly 40% of items test students on math that they learned before high school. And you'd think, oh, that's really easy, just basic area or volume, adding fractions, least common multiple, but when they're tested on the ACT, they're tested in challenging ways with many steps and a high cognitive load. If you're familiar with depth of knowledge levels, they're higher depth of knowledge levels. They're being knocked down to 20%. So at the same time, ACT is also reducing the number of questions in the advanced topics category, which are considered higher grade level items. We're just not sure which ones they are, because many of the ones that we projected to be on the chopping block have shown up in the examples that we see in the official ACT prep guide. All of the reported changes suggest an easier math test. And we're here to tell you there's not going to be an easier math test. In fact, Amy and I did a podcast recently with someone who took the April 2025 Enhanced ACT Field Test. And one piece of information that was reported was that the difficulty on the math section ramped up quickly. On both the legacy and enhanced ACT, the math section items go in approximate order of difficulty. So the first question should be easiest, the last question should be hardest. And what appears to have happened is that ACT has just carved out, say, 10 easier questions. And so you get from easy to challenging more quickly. And that's the math.
And if they want to know more about those specific changes from our secret test taker, they should check out episode 643 to hear in her own words what she thought about the math. So in terms of the reading section, again, this is going to be a section where we know that the number of questions have been reduced. We know that the amount of time students will have will be greater. Keep in mind that In terms of the percentage of questions aligned to integration ideas reporting category, we know that will increase. Now, traditionally, what that has been is students get a paired passage. So when you're comparing and contrasting, let's say these two different authors, these two different passages, that we're seeing that potentially that's going to go up in terms of in that passage. We also know that sometimes there will be some comparing and contrasting that may happen in other single passages as well, but that category is going up. In terms of the sourcing of the readings, we know that for the literary narrative passages, ACT is definitely trying to kind of up their sort of cultural relativity. So they're trying to increase the sort of authenticity of culturally diverse perspectives in those passages. Now, it's also worthy of note that traditionally what we would expect is that one of the literary narrative passage should be one of the passages, and then 3 additional passages would traditionally be social science, followed by humanities, followed by the natural sciences. Those terms are being changed. So students will no longer see reference to social science, natural science, or humanities. They will see the reference to literary narrative or informational. But that doesn't just mean they'll get one literary narrative. So remember, if one of these passages is field test, it's possible that students could have 2 literary narrative passages and 2 informational, or they might just have 1 literary narrative and 3 informational. The key thing is just that typically what we've read is that the first and the last reading passage will not be field test passages. So students have to realize that potentially one of either passage 2 or 3 will not count towards their score. What we also know is that ACT announced in 2021 that they were going to start to incorporate VQI, or visual quantitative information passages. So what does that mean? It means a passage where students are going to be provided some graphical information. So this is going to focus more on a student's graphical literacy as opposed to necessarily their textual literacy. This is something that we've seen before. The SAT has included graphs or tables or charts within their reading passages. So this is definitely a trend that we're seeing in more standardized exams with regards to reading. Now, in the past, what we've noticed is these VQI passages have traditionally been seen only in state ACT tests, but the expectation is that we'll start to see more of them in these actual new enhanced ACT reading passages.
So the ACT science test is changed in a way that's very interesting, because the changes that we're seeing on the other sections are all new. We've never seen versions of the English, math, or reading like they're going to look now. But ACT science is actually reverting in a sense to a prior version of the ACT, where there used to be 7 science passages instead of 6. And then in around 2015, ACT changed that to 6 passages. We're going back to 7 passages, and they have maintained the same number of items, 40 questions, but now students will have 40 minutes in which to answer these questions. The other changes are all speculative, in that ACT says they're going to increase the number of questions that require specific science background knowledge. In our experience, many of those questions that are coded as science background knowledge questions are just common sense. And students that come to the science test with high school biology and 1 other high school level science, that's the level of science that they're expected. So it's not required that students have taken physics or chemistry at the high school level to do well on the ACT. Traditionally, those 4 content areas, biology, chemistry, physics, and earth-space science, will remain on the test, and there will be the addition of an engineering and design passage. There will be some rebalancing, but ultimately what we're imagining is that the ACT science test will remain just what it's always been, basically a reading test, a test of graphical literacy, a test of experimental design. And the changes that we'll see will be minor for anyone that is already good at ACT science.
And I think we'll both agree, Mike, that in terms of saying they're going to increase the number of questions that require specialized knowledge, that isn't going to mean that students will now have to somehow crack out their biology textbook or crack out a physics textbook. It really does hover in that region of common sense most of the time. And our tester in April did say they didn't feel like there was any additional science required than what they've seen in the past.
Absolutely.
So in terms of composite scores, right, keep in mind that the ACT awards a score between 1 and 36 for each of the 4 sections. So students will get a score in English, math, reading, science. Now, keep in mind that if students were to take the ACT in this new enhanced format in either April, June, or July of 2025, and they do that in the digital format, their composite will only be comprised of their English, math, and reading score. So we kind of refer to it now as an EMR score. Now, students who are testing in September of 2025, whether they're testing digitally or they're testing on paper, those students will only get a score for English, math, and reading that will be averaged together to create the composite. So the basic idea is you get a score between 1 and 36 per section, and then those 3 scores will be averaged together to create your composite. Keep in mind at that point in time, if a student has, let's say 22.20 or 22.33, it will round down. Whereas if they have a 0.666, then they will round up. Now, ACT will continue to report students will receive a science score, but it will be an entirely separate score. If a student does do the science, they will also receive a STEM score as well. That's sort of their math and their science scores combined. But the basic idea is just that for a student, they're going to have this decision to make as to whether that they want to take science, but science scores will no longer be comprised, will be a part of a student's overall composite score. Now, an interesting sort of dilemma has arisen for the class of 2026 if they are testing or have tested in the new enhanced format, because some students may find, if they're testing in April, June, or July, that maybe it's possible with their ACT super score that the composite actually might have gone down without having science there. Now, what ACT is committed to doing for those students is to make sure that they do not get a lower composite as a result of having taken that enhanced test. What we do know from ACT is that about 3% of testers in the April, which accounts for about 511 students testing on the enhanced, those were the students affected. Now, if you are aware or you are affected by a lower super score because of taking the enhanced in April, June, or July, you should have received an email from ACT. If not, this is the information where you can call or you can check the website to find what is the way in which you can sort of back channel with ACT to make sure that you currently have the highest super score possible, even if it was administered in this new enhanced form.
So let's sum up what we know about the ACT in its enhanced form. Okay, first, on the surface, there's more time per question and fewer questions. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that students will have a lot more time, because it seems like what has been carved out might be some of the easier or quicker to answer questions on each section. The total length of the test is much shorter, especially if you don't take the science test. However, even though the science section is optional, students should consider sitting for it unless they know for certain that the schools that they're applying to will not want the science. Some schools will require science from every applicant. Some schools will require science from STEM major applicants. Some schools will say they don't want to see the science test at all, and there's no advantage whatsoever to taking it. But until you know what category you fall in, consider taking science. There are experimental questions in each section. These field test items will not count towards your score. The field test items may be predictable. Not on the math section, but on any passage-based section, the current guidelines state that the first passage and the final passage cannot be field test items. You can also tell based on the number of field test items per section that some passages won't qualify. For example, there are 6 field test items on the science test, and there are only 5 items per data representation passage, so data representation can't be the field test passage. It's too soon to get into that, but it's important to recognize that as we are learning more about the tests, we're recognizing the ways in which test takers can approach the exam, putting their best foot forward. The content is basically the same, and that's really good to know because there are a lot of practice passages and a lot of practice problems accumulated over 50 years from the ACT. some of the tiny changes about math, dropping the number of number of choices per question. Some reading passages will be shorter, some English passages will be shorter. The reading might include the VQI or a paired passage each time, and we won't know what. Science section not only will be optional, but will include an engineering passage. We haven't seen a version of this yet, but we're looking forward to it. The composite is your EMR, your English Math Reading scores. And ACT will maintain their policy of making available for order 3 tests a year. Instead of test information release, it's now being called My ACT Answer Key. And the dates are known, and Amy's going to share which dates they are. But it means that test takers have a fantastic opportunity that they don't have on the SAT to sit for a test, order the test, and review the actual test that they took and learn from it, which is very powerful.
So if we talk about the schedule of upcoming tests, we can see, at least over the course of the next, let's say, year into the summer, we're going to find that generally speaking, there's always an ACT offered in July, September, October, December, February, April, and June. We can also see on here what those My Answer Key dates are going to be. I do want to mention that anybody that I can speak with who's in the class of 2027, who's interested in doing preparation, or let's say wants to try the ACT in its new form, I would highly recommend considering taking the October 18th ACT to get that opportunity at being able to test, get your scores, but most importantly, get that My Answer Key back to take a look at what they got wrong and use that in anticipation of retesting in the future. Now, you'll notice our SAT test dates. One interesting thing is that the SAT is now offering a test date in September. That's totally brand new. So students will have the opportunity in the fall, if you will, for really 3 to 4 dates if you want to consider August through November. Now, do keep in mind, if a student is planning on applying early action or early decision, we would generally say that probably on the SAT, you can take SAT into October, or the ACT you can take into September. So if you do plan to apply early, it's really important to make sure that you realize that despite the fact there are additional test dates, they may not be dates for you in an early application period. You can see on here too where you register to take both the SAT and the ACT. It's also important to know that SAT scores are released 13 days after the test date online, and traditionally ACT scores are released 10 days after. Now, there's always the possibility that your ACT test scores will release beyond the 10 days. We do know that traditionally 1 test date or maybe 2 test dates a year may be what we call equating tests, where students, they might be using student results to sort of recenter the curve, if you will, of the test. So sometimes you might see that, but generally speaking, most test scores should be available 10 days after you take the ACT. Keep in mind there are in-school ACTs or SATs offered to juniors in many states. Those are typically offered in the months of March or April. Students do not have to register for those because that is done by your actual school, and the school or the state is paying for those tests. We can see here that it does look like if a student is a junior, a class of 2027, that if they want a test to be able to get access to their test and answers, April and June will be great test dates to be able to do that. However, there is no ability when it comes to the SAT to get your test or answers back.
So a couple of these dates should be circled on your calendar, especially if a student is a current rising senior or junior. September 6th is when the enhanced ACT becomes the law of the land. And then you can choose to take it on computer, or more likely you can choose to take it on paper, because in many locations you'll have many more paper options. Also because we recommend that you take this paper-based test on paper, but that's September 6th, everything's enhanced. Until then, meaning in June and in July, students can still take a legacy ACT. Now, the July date is available in every state except for New York, but New Yorkers can travel to Pennsylvania or New Jersey or Hawaii, wherever they want to go and take the test. And
Make
there's
it a
a lot
vacation.
of it happens. There's a lot of value for students, especially those already engaged in prep, to complete their prep with the legacy test, taking advantage of the wealth of resources that are available and the things that are known about the ACT. The legacy test, we didn't point out, but it's a much more stable exam because there are more questions. And that means that what students score in practice, they can often count on earning on test day, assuming nerves don't get to them. Whereas on tests like the SAT, where there are fewer items, tests are more volatile and you get a couple of more questions wrong and your score suffers dramatically from it. That may be what we see in the future ACT scales. It's too early to tell, but if you're already in a mode where you're getting ready for the ACT, the July 12th ACT date is valuable. Now, some are even asking, like, should we take the test at all? Is that necessary? And without belaboring the point, the era of peak test optional is past, okay? We're done. That doesn't mean that test optional is gone, but test optional policies have changed a lot. There is real value in testing. Most selective schools have either gone all the way over the line and said that they require test scores, or they've stepped as close to the line as they can and say they highly recommend it. When you're determining whether testing is important for your application purposes, consider this. You can understand very clearly what a test blind policy means. Test blind means the SAT and ACT will not be considered for admissions purposes no matter how well you do. Don't even bother submitting. Test required provides great clarity as well. They require a test score from you. Everything in the middle is ambiguous because test optional can mean a lot of different things. Test optional can mean really, really optional. If you go into a college's common data set and you look at the submitter rate from last year's incoming freshman class, and you see that only 20% of those students submitted test scores, you know that that school is very, very test optional. But if you look at the common data set and you see that the schools that 80% of last year's incoming freshman class submitted test scores, you know that it's not so optional at all. It might be flexible, it might be test preferred, test expected. There are many euphemisms today to try to thread the needle of whatever the schools are trying to transmit. Test optional admissions will not go away because it benefits schools. However, test optional admissions is applied differently everywhere. On the one hand, keep in mind, roughly 3/4 of schools accept at least 3/4 of applicants. So there are schools for everybody, even if they struggle with standardized tests. But selective schools and selectivity has reached insane heights. And we have many schools now that only accept 3% of applicants, and they're pretty much all submitting test scores. Now, the other question, it's not just should I take a test at all, but should I think about the SAT? And there are good reasons to consider the SAT. The SAT and ACT both serve the same purpose, and they are seen by colleges equally as college entrance exams that provide them a lot of valuable information. The tests overlap in that they both test reading, writing, and math, and that's now what your composite for either test will be based on. That said, there are some differences. Okay, so first you can tell from, and we borrowed this graphic from Test Innovators. They do a great job with these graphics. And we love the fact that if you put the sections and the amount of time per section side by side, you could see that if you take the ACT without science, you're slightly faster. You're out just a few minutes earlier than if you took the SAT the way it's administered, okay? Now, the SAT, entirely computer-based, entirely digital, and section adaptive, meaning that your baseline reading writing module determines the difficulty of your second reading writing module, same for math. And different items, different questions carry different weight. The ACT, you have the choice of paper or device. We recommend paper for the time being for a bunch of reasons. Mainly that the ACT is designed to be taken on paper. It's easier on paper when you have long passages to work with. And also, every question on the ACT carries the same weight. It's one raw score point, And that means that the easier it is to move around and find the questions you want to work on, the more likely it is you're going to scoop your maximum number of points. The SAT is half math. The ACT is 1/3 math. If math is your strength, especially Algebra 2 and graphing, you may love the SAT. The ACT, if you are much better with a breadth of topics in algebra, arithmetic, geometry, statistics, then ACT math might be for you. Also, the hardest questions on the SAT are the hardest questions. The hardest reading questions, the hardest math, right, Amy? The hardest math
100%.
questions are
They
on
are.
the SAT. The ACT, consider the SAT an exam with fewer pieces of content that you have to learn, okay? Fewer math items, fewer grammar rules, more vocabulary, but other than that, but it's deep. It requires a lot of logical reasoning. The ACT requires a breadth of knowledge, but not as much depth. A lot of superficial reading, a lot of close reading, a lot of just implementing the same grammar rules and math formulas over and over again. There are ways to figure out which test is best for you, but generally, you can tell that if reading and writing is your strength, the ACT might be better. Now, how do you know if the SAT is better for you? One of the tests that I like to do is like, just, do you like logic games? Do you like puzzles? Do you like to play video games and like hack the system? Because that you might have the right mindset. If you are really comfortable with graphing and you're willing to learn how to use the Desmos calculator, which is built into the Blue Book test platform, then you could really benefit on the SAT. ACT has multiple testing platforms, and the enhanced test, when it's released in September, likely will not have built-in Desmos, but that doesn't mean that down the line we won't see integrated Desmos, okay? The SAT is much more of an Algebra 2 test, and sometimes with timing, when we try to advise families on which test might be better for their teens, if a teen hasn't taken Algebra 2 yet, they can still prep for and probably do very well on the ACT. Roughly 80% of the math content on the ACT is pre-Algebra 2. And you can score, if you get every non-Algebra 2 question right on the ACT and you don't get any of the Algebra 2 questions right, I think it's been calculated that you can still earn like a 29, which is pretty impressive. The SAT, do not walk into that test without some strength in Algebra 2. Okay, there are shorter reading passages. We described that the ACT, all of the verbal sections are passage based. You have a passage with anywhere from 5 to 10 questions based on the section on that passage. The SAT gives you one passage per reading or writing question. You're still reading roughly the same amount of text, but you're doing it in a much more fluid way. You read a passage and work on a question, then you read another passage and you work on a question. Whereas the ACT gives you that opportunity to kind of understand a passage and work with it and answer a bunch of questions on it. So there are definitely reasons that some students are much better prepared for, aligned with, and equipped to excel on the SAT. The best way to find out which test is best for you is to take both of them, but not officially. Don't take an official test to figure out how you're going to do. Instead, take advantage of an abundance of practice material. Amy's going to talk about the resources that are available.
So in terms of test prep resources, it is important to mention that really with the ACT changing and even with the SAT only having changed really about a year ago, there are limited resources available. Traditionally in test preparation, most of us, if we're worth our salt, are recommending that students work on only official test materials put out by the actual testing companies, but there aren't quite as many of them available as there used to be. Now, keep in mind, traditionally, the ACT has posted a PDF booklet on their website called Preparing for the ACT. Generally speaking, for someone taking a paper-based test, they would access that PDF format on the ACT website, print it out, and then administer the test themselves. That test will be available probably by mid-June. We just know that right now they have not posted that test. However, what that test will be is already available on the ACT website in an online digital format. So for those students who are taking this current digital enhanced ACT, they can get practice for it on an online test on the ACT website. Most importantly, there is what we call the Wiley Red Book, the official ACT Prep Guide textbook. There is a version 2025-2026 that does have 4 ACT tests in it with scoring and answers and explanations. Now, it is important to realize that that book has essentially taken ACTs from previous editions to create these 4 new enhanced tests that meet the specifications for the new test. If a student is going to be testing digitally, that book will also provide a student with the code that they can go online and access those same 4 tests in the book in a digital format online. Now, as far as preparation for the SAT, there is the College Board Blue Book app, which does provide students with 7 official SATs they can take, 2 official PSATs they can take, as well as the question bank provided by College Board that has well over 2,000 individual questions that students can use. They can search it by sort of criteria, they can search it by difficulty in order to practice more. Keep in mind, though, there are the official ACT prep guides from years past that because the actual content of the ACT isn't actually changing, students can definitely consider going back over the last few years and accessing those tests from 2020 or 2019 or 2023, knowing that they can work on those questions, not so much for timing and diagnostic scoring as much as just using them for individual questions to essentially create their own ACT question bank. If a student has the ability to take the October ACT or the April or the June, keep in mind that those students will have access to be able to purchase that My Answer Key, which can be very instrumental in reviewing and learning from in order to take a future test. And then most importantly, there are lots of curated resources from test prep professionals. Now, in the past, most test prep professionals would have said just use official material, but that simply isn't the case anymore because we just don't have as many resources to do so. So there are resources like Mike's Roots to Words. We definitely know that vocabulary is a significant factor in the performance of students on the SAT and may also be a factor in your ACT performance. So students who feel like they've got weaker vocabularies should check out resources like Roots to Words. Obviously, Tests and the Rest spends a lot of time on the podcast exploring all kinds of testing, test prep information. So listening to episodes there relevant to each test can be very useful or helpful. And then most importantly is to realize there are a lot of third-party practice tests out there. We definitely recommend if you're working with a test prep professional to follow their advice in terms of which test prep platform are they recommending or are they using with their students. But unlike years past where you could access a lot of official diagnostic tests for yourself online, that simply isn't the case. So definitely check out some of these third-party platforms. Now, ultimately, the question really is, what is the best test prep? And what we definitely know is students who are readers, who read more, who read at least 15 minutes a day, will almost always achieve better scores on tests like the SAT and the ACT. We also know that if students take more rigorous coursework, we definitely know that's helpful for your transcript and your GPA for college admissions, but we know that if you take harder classes, that's generally going to benefit you when you take tests like the SAT and ACT. Students should be practicing critical thinking and problem solving in their everyday life as they read passages, as they read math questions, to sort of know that practicing it every day leads to good testing as well. We mentioned earlier, lots of good official practice test material to use for prep is our recommendation. But most importantly, if your student is working on practice tests, they need to realize that just blowing through these tests is not going to serve them well because there are fewer official tests. So it's really important when a student takes a practice test and corrects it to go through and look at what did they pick, why was it wrong, what do they need to review or learn for the future so that they don't make that mistake again. Ultimately, all of this is going to require some perseverance on the student's part. Learning isn't easy and nor should it be. So students do have to develop some perseverance to make sure that sticking with it, working hard, will give them that great result in their testing. And then lastly, for a lot of our students, they may have never worked with a tutor. They may have never supplemented their education outside of school, but you really shouldn't be afraid to reaching out for the help of a test prep professional. Most importantly, when you work with a test prep professional, There's an efficiency and there's an effectiveness in being able to get the goal score you want and hopefully achieve it in the smallest amount of time possible.
I like the way you put that. Efficiency and effectiveness. Working
Mm-hmm.
with the right coach, you can get farther faster.
If you do have additional questions, if you're looking for assistance with any sort of testing, test prep, know that both Mike at Share It Learning and myself at Sealy Test Pros and LEAP, we offer group classes for SAT and ACT throughout the calendar year. We offer ACT and SAT one-on-one tutoring 7 days a week. I'm not going to say 24 hours a day, but certainly every day of the week, right?
Zone.
We both have certified and professional tutors. And then most importantly, Mike and I definitely do a lot of work with professional development in terms of the work we've done for the AIM program at ACT. Mike certainly is a curriculum developer, as you can see by his CV that he shared with you earlier. So please let us feel free to be your resource. So reach out to us. You've got our emails, our phone numbers there to give us a call or email.
We could talk all day about the enhanced ACT and how to plan for it. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Tests and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Test and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.